Perfect. Already, we are live. Folks, hello and welcome to the Accelerates LinkedIn Live with this high performance leadership series. And we're really excited to welcome Nathen Harvey as our guest today. Um, Nathen Harvey is the DORA lead and developer advocate from Google. He has helped thousands of teams improve. Are we ready? We are live. I have just back. Welcome to the apologies, some technical issues there live.
It's clear we're doing it live. That's right.
There you go. We are definitely live. So I think we've fixed that now. Alrighty. So Nathan has essentially helped thousands of teams improve how they build and operate software. So essentially using DORA's research-backed approach to accelerate speed, stability, and developer experience. And as a co-author of the Accelerate reports and editor of 97 Things Every Cloud Engineer Should Know, Nathan is one of the go-to voices on what high-performing teams truly look like. So whether you're leading delivery, driving strategy, or building a case for change, this is definitely going to be a good conversation for you. So just as a way of introduction, I'm from Accelerate. I'm the director of enterprise solutions here, and yeah, we'll cover a few sections today. And if you have any questions, any comments, please use the comment functionality. Say hi. Let us know where you're viewing from, and leave any questions that you might have for Nathen, and we will aim to get to them throughout. So yeah, Nathen. So from that DORA perspective, do you want to give us a bit of a sort of like who are you and why should people listen?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me, Shane. It's really great to be here. So hi everyone. As Shane mentioned, my name is Nathen Harvey. I lead up the DORA program here within Google Cloud. And DORA, you may know, it's a research program that's been looking into how do high performing teams build and sustain themselves, right? How do we safely and quickly deliver software into the hands of our users so that we can get feedback on it and we can figure out what's the next change we want to make to this software. The research program itself is program and platform agnostic. It's not research into how do you use Google or how do you use Google tools. It truly is program and platform agnostic, and it tries to take a holistic view of teams and organizations. So, of course, we look at things like technical practices, but we also look beyond that into how does the team organize, what processes do they follow, what's the culture like in the organization, and so forth. The research has been going on for over a decade now. In fact, last year we published our 10th report in our annual series. And actually, just a few months ago, we published another report that's all about the impact of generative AI on software development, because of course, that's what everyone is learning and experiencing today. What is this generative AI and how is it helping us all improve?
And we're definitely going to dig into that sort of AI piece in this
Sure.
session today. I'm definitely curious to hear your thoughts on it. You like so for me, my introduction to like DORA was working with a group of DevOps engineers, and they brought on this book called Accelerate, and that was my
Mhm.
sort of first introduction into it, and it really grabbed my attention because it was just so easy to read. Um, from a non-technical perspective. So I just the way that's research has been translated and how it's enabled business leaders to really to consume it. I found super impactful. And every year the report comes out, it's always I'm always excited to hear what's new.
Yeah, that book Accelerate which was written by Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Jazz Humble, and Gene Kim,
Hmm.
who were leading up the research at the time. That book really was kind of foundational in launching DORA. Although it was sort of a summary of the first 4 or 5 years of the research, I think that putting it all together in book form really helped teams start to take and understand deeper the research itself. Unfortunately, many people read that book and stop at about page 17, which is where the DORA software delivery metrics are introduced. And that's kind of where people stop. They find these 4 metrics and they say, yes, perfect. This is all we need is 4 measures to change everything that we do. And of course, metrics aren't enough to change anything. Maybe to start a conversation, which is always good. The book and the ongoing research goes deeper to look into the capabilities and conditions that allow for that high performance and specifically high performance over time. So in a sustainable way, which is of course very, very important.
Yeah, there's some really nice pieces connecting that back into like burnout and
Yep.
stuff from a sustainability perspective. So in terms of like these reports, what's one of the insights from the 10th DORA reports that's I suppose maybe challenged your thinking?
Yeah, so the 10th Story report, obviously there's a milestone to celebrate, which is always exciting. But in that report, we really looked into, I would say, kind of 3 big themes. The first theme, of course, being AI. It comes alphabetically first, and it's top of mind for everyone right now.
Mm.
The other theme that we looked into was platform engineering and sort of what is the role of platform engineering in helping, build those high performing teams. And then finally, we looked into developer experience and sort of what does that look like? What's the day-to-day life of a developer or, developers kind of a rough term, maybe. We use it very broadly. Really, I would say any technical practitioner or anyone that's working on a technically driven team. So that, of course, would include folks like product owners, product managers, and so forth. Yeah.
And
And
uh,
so I think like one of the things I found rather surprising was that, and certainly there's a lot of AI findings that we'll dig into in a minute, but maybe we'll just start with something that's not AI. It really is around that developer experience. And one of the things that we found, and again, some of our findings aren't necessarily shockers, but it's always good to have some real data to back up some of our instincts, if you will. So one of the big findings we found was that teams that work in organizations with stable priorities, where the priorities aren't changing every day or every week, these teams tend to have better job satisfaction, lower burnout, in essence, higher well-being for the people in those teams. Again, not really a surprise, but I think for leaders, it's really important to take that away and remember how can I, as a leader, really keep the team focused on what is our big goal, and let's keep that big goal relatively constant. Of course, we may see some slight shifts in it, but if we're always sort of jerking our teams back and forth, it becomes very, very difficult for them to make good progress. And I guess in almost an ironic way, AI is helping with this. And it's not that AI is helping leaders, they're not going to the Gen AI and saying, what should our long-term goal be? But there is so much pressure right now across every organization to get more out of artificial intelligence that is kind of giving us all a guiding light, sort of that lighthouse. We're headed towards this North Star, which is better utilization of artificial intelligence across the board for basically every business function, which of course includes software engineering.
Cool. It's really nice to hear like you describe about developer experience and just not being for developers, but that sort of wider sort of like team that's around that technical practice. So it's really nice to hear that's defined in
Yeah.
in that way. And the AI paradox is fascinating. Like what's the story behind this finding?
Yeah, for sure. So first we should define the AI paradox. If in case you haven't read the report, I will forgive you for that, but please do go download the report. You can get it at dora.dev. But one of the things that we found, as I said, we looked into AI and as I mentioned earlier, DORA has these software delivery performance metrics that we look at. And really DORA's sort of center of gravity, if you will, is around software delivery performance, really trying to answer these questions of how much change can an organization or a team get through the system? And then how stable are those changes? Well, when we see AI adoption increasing, one of the things that we see that's maybe this paradox here is that stability and throughput of change actually fall off. So you're moving a little bit slower, and probably more concerning, the stability of the changes that you're pushing through to production goes down by about 7 or 8%. And that the way that we measure stability there is we look at, of the changes that you're pushing to production, how many of them cause an immediate reaction from your team? A deployment of shipping change to your production environment should be a boring thing. There should be no drama. It should be, we pushed a change and life went on. But we all know, unfortunately, that that's not always the case. Sometimes we push a change and someone shouts out an expletive. We've got to roll that change back or push forward a hot fix. So in DORA, we call that the change failure rate. So of the deployments that you've done, how many or what percentage of them require immediate attention? And then we also look at, of the deployments that you're doing, how many of those are unplanned deployments? So and an unplanned deployment really is a good proxy or a good measure for the amount of rework that your team is having to do. And of course, none of us show up in the office in the morning to say, what I'm going to do today is redo all of the work that I did yesterday. That's not how we move forward. But again, sometimes we have to rework things. So we see, as you're increasing AI adoption, stability falls off of those changes. So you're having to rework more. You're having more of those expletive moments, if you will.
So this is really interesting because whenever I first heard about like the DORA metrics, that longer lead time for change
Mhm.
normally coincided with like smaller deployment frequency and like larger
Yes.
batch size. So like much more like risk built into the deployments, which kind of led to that like lesser stability. Are,
Mhm.
are deployments get like is there anything changing that sort of like batch size as part of this, or is it just because there's AI involved and
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, our data can't pinpoint exactly why, and this is kind of one of the failures of relying solely on metrics. We can't get to the why behind that, and I think to get to the why, we have to sit down and have conversations with our team. We have to, as researchers, we have to come up with some hypotheses that we can then go and test. So we do have a number of hypotheses around why this is happening, and you've touched on one of them. I think that, while AI has certainly helped developers do a lot of things, right? We see higher job satisfaction, we see more time spent in flow, we see higher documentation quality, we even see code complexity and technical debt both coming down. But at the same time, we're seeing these throughput and stability numbers fall off. I think that, frankly, AI hasn't changed sort of the physics of delivering software, if you will. Small
Mhm.
batches, minimizing the amount of work that you have in process. I think these are still very much key enablers of better software delivery performance. In fact, when you think about sort of any system that's delivering anything, whether it's software changes or a production line for building automobiles, there's always something in that change, in that system, if you will, that holds the system back, a constraint somewhere in that system or a bottleneck. And if you make a change outside of that bottleneck, basically one of two things can happen. Your performance will stay the same. And how can that happen? Well, if I make an improvement outside of the bottleneck, but maybe downstream of the bottleneck is still the bottleneck. So performance is going to stay the same. The other thing that could happen is your performance can drop off. And so this would typically be seen if we're making an improvement in advance of the bottleneck. So I often think about this, when we're using AI as a developer, I can generate a lot more code in the same amount of time that it took me to generate less code. And if we go back to this idea of shipping in smaller batches, well, now I'm tempted as a developer to send a much larger change through because I can do so. But of course, if we're sending more and more code to a review stage, to a test stage, like this is necessarily going to slow us down because we've improved outside of the bottleneck, and the speed with which or the amount of code that we generate just wasn't the bottleneck. So I think this is really a pointer to us as an industry to look beyond simply code generation. And don't get me wrong, using AI to generate code is amazing. And it's getting better every day. And our ability to interact with it and leverage it is getting better every day. But when we step back and look at the entire system, it's not our constraint. There's constraints elsewhere in the system that we need to go and address.
follow that constraint and that bottleneck.
That's right.
So you're kind of so we're touching on the DORA metrics. We kind of touched on it earlier about those four proxy metrics, and people
Yeah.
stopping at that part of the book. Um, so like, how can leaders turn DORA metrics into action and not just be this dashboard or these four proxy metrics?
Yeah, it is a real challenge. And unfortunately, this is where the work actually happens. It's not, capturing the metrics and putting them on a dashboard is, in some sense, it's easy. It may involve, tying together and integrating a bunch of systems. That work definitely can be difficult to do, but in the end, you're striving towards a dashboard. But a dashboard doesn't drive change. I think that it is really important for leaders to think of a couple of things. First and foremost, those software delivery performance metrics aren't necessarily for the leader. They're really meant for the team that's responsible for building, delivering, operating that software system. And they should be used as sort of a compass to understand sort of where are we headed? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we improving over time? Or are we not headed in the right direction? And then based on those signals, I think it's really important that the team then has a conversation, right? What are these signals telling us? If we're not improving, where is our constraint? What's holding us back? And then most importantly, what experiments are we going to run in order to improve those? And this is where DORA's research, the whole body of research really comes in. On Dora.dev, under the research tab, you'll find our core model. The DORA core model is really a look at the capabilities and conditions that we've investigated over the years, and it really helps you tie together which capabilities on the left-hand side lead to better performance numbers, and then the real thing that we care about, better organizational performance and better well-being for the people on our team. And so as leaders, you really want to encourage your team to take these numbers to understand how you're doing, but then to really drive the conversation in that model more to the left of the model to understand what's holding us back. Let's say, for example, we wanted to improve our change lead time. So we want to shorten the amount of time it takes from code to go from committed to the developer's workstation all the way through to production. Well, if you want to improve that time, probably the first thing you need to do is understand where is all that time going? What are we doing in that time window? And a tool like or a process like value stream mapping can be really powerful here if you sit down with a cross-functional team to really understand and physically map out what are all of the steps that we go through. And in many, many teams, one of the biggest bottlenecks is a review and approval process for any change that happens. And unfortunately, that review and approval process can actually happen in multiple different phases. You might have something like a code review phase where from engineer to engineer, we're looking at the code, we're looking at the change to make sure that it, follows all of the norms that we have, that we aren't seeing anything that is potentially dangerous in this change. And hopefully it's actually addressing the concern we meant to. But then beyond that code review stage, there's sometimes also sort of a change approval process that maybe involves people outside of the technical team that's responsible for that application. You may bring in other voices, whether that's business owners, other technical practices like security or audit comes in. This again creates sometimes a significant bottleneck. And the reason that these bottlenecks become so bad is because what we're really doing is we're delaying the feedback that an engineer gets on their change. I heard one time many years ago that every line of code that we write is really an experiment. We have no idea if it's actually going to do what we expect it to do. We can't know that for certain until we get that change in the hands of users to see how are they going to interact with that, or how are they going to leverage that. And so when we extend those feedback cycles, the natural inclination of an engineer is to finish task one and move on to another task. And if it takes, days, weeks, months even to get feedback on that task that you did, that change that you made, now I've got to context switch back into, well, what was I thinking at that time? What problem was I trying to address? And all of this really is pernicious in terms of degrading software delivery throughput and software delivery stability.
Yeah, and you're kind of talking to that around like the perspective of a single engineer. When you scale this up and you look at more
Yes.
like systems, like that just it gets bigger and bigger, and that risk that gets carried in the task switching across different teams. It just it escalates, right?
That's right. And then you start seeing that, the tight coupling that you might have between teams becomes another constraint, right? So how do
Mhm.
we enable teams to like move fast alone so that we
Mm.
can and we do that through looser coupling of the teams. So we reduce the dependencies that we have on one another, or we improve the contracts that we have between each other so that the way that we interact is well known, well established, and hopefully it's something that can be automated away, right? And this is where you get into things like APIs and building APIs between teams and having good, strong contracts there.
Okay, so let's dig into AI and engineering performance for a bit. So, what's the difference between using AI tools and actually building with AI?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I think it's something that as researchers we're having a little bit of a difficulty sort of unpicking, if you will. AI is kind of taken over the world right now. And it's being used everywhere, right? And so we in our research we really want to try to distinguish, like, so Shane, are you building AI experiences for your customers? That might look like, I don't know, embedding a chatbot into your support system as an example. Well, in order to do that, you've suddenly become an AI engineer, right? You need to understand more about how do I build, manage, and operate large language models, or maybe even small language models, but language models nevertheless, which maybe is a new skill set for you or for the team. And on the other hand, we have folks like yourself that are using AI in their daily work, right? So if my job as a software engineer, my job is to build features and to get those features into production. Now I have another tool in my toolbox, AI, that can help with that. And but in either case, like, AI is actually too general of a term. We need to understand where and how are you using AI. So if you're a software engineer, are you using AI to generate code? Well, but then how are you using AI to generate code? Are you using like autocomplete? Are you using a chat feature? Are you handing a coding task off to an agent that's doing all of that for you? All of these are valid ways of interacting with AI today, and hard for us to kind of pick apart in our data. But we do try to distinguish between teams that are building AI functionality for their end users, their customers, and teams that are leveraging AI throughout the daily work that they're doing right now.
So with AI being this sort of umbrella term, but when we
Yeah,
like under the hoods, there's actually like a lot of complexity in terms of like how you're using it and from the sort of user perspective. And you kind of mentioned like two different
yeah,
personas, but there's also like I suppose people that swivel chair between both personas, so they're like building these experiences, but they're using AI tools to do that as well. Um,
absolutely.
so there's a lot of risk in this space. And in terms of like engineering leaders today and even experienced engineering leaders, what's and how should they be thinking about the governance around AI and the associated risks?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And one of the other things that we look into is how is AI adoption going, and sort of what are the precursors to adoption or the enablers of adoption. And one of the things that we see as the biggest enabler of more AI adoption within an organization is clear policies around acceptable use of AI. So what does governance look like? What data can you share with which models? What use cases are you using across the organization? What is, as you said, our governance and sort of compliance guardrails that we're putting around those use cases? And I think that as a leader, it is really important that you not only help set the policy, but also make sure that it's very clear and that it's applicable to everyone that's going to be using AI. That isn't to say that you should have necessarily a general policy, but you should have enough policy in place so that as an individual contributor, I know that this is a good use of AI, that this is well governed. We have the guardrails, we have the risk controls built around this use of AI. But then I also think, going back to that role as a software engineer, if AI is helping me generate more code and build things faster, I think the feedback and mechanisms that we've always had in place become even more important, because frankly, a lot of my job is moving from writing code to reviewing code and to specifying what problems I want solved. So my role is changing a lot with AI, but the AI is still sort of guessing, if you will. If every change is an experiment, the AI is still running experiments. So we need to build stronger feedback mechanisms in. On the one hand, I'm at least mildly optimistic that some of the practices that we've seen be really successful, things like test-driven development, maybe finally more engineers are ready to adopt that because they have AI that they can leverage in that process
Mm.
of specifying the tests and really doing design first by writing tests to understand sort of what are the boundaries of this particular function, how is it expected to work before implementing that code. I think that's something I think we should all be optimistic about. We can bring more testing, better feedback cycles in, provided we're using AI in the right ways.
So we need to have that good governance, good policy setting, great guardrails, to really support our technical people, in that space. So do you have like one real world example of where AI has enhanced AI, or maybe undermines AI delivery performance?
Yeah, I've heard, and I've heard this second or third hand, but I've heard of some organizations that are that are telling their engineers that AI is it's requisite, it's required. You can no longer do your job without AI. And I think it was Shopify whose CEO came out and said, we're not going to do any more hiring on
Mm.
any team until you demonstrate that you can't hit your capacity goals with AI. If you're still struggling, then we'll consider hiring someone in. On the one hand, I think this is good in that it sort of drives teams to use more AI. And frankly, AI is like any other tool. You can look at it from afar and I don't know, let's take a hammer. You can look at a hammer and like see the beauty in it and understand how that hammer can really help you drive a nail in. But until you pick up a hammer and try to hammer in a nail, like you don't really know what's that hammer good for, right? And how do you best use it? How do you hold it in your hand? And so I think that these policies that are coming down and forcing AI, on the one hand, they're good in that they're forcing us all to get more experience with AI. The truth of the matter is that AI is so new. We're all still learning. And not only are the models getting better every day, but our ability to interact with them and to understand this is what this model is good for, and this is maybe where it struggles, where I need to bring in more of my problem solving skills, my engineering skills to help with this particular problem. So I think it is helping adoption, but it's also introducing fear at the same time, right? If you're not using these tools, something negative might happen to you, up to and including, you might be let go because you're
Mm.
not utilizing AI enough. And I think we need to do more to remember that these AIs, like they aren't here to replace us. They're here to augment the work that we do. They are here to give us sort of more superpowers, if you will. But it's a fine balance, I think. And I think the best way to achieve that balance is to be open and honest. Again, back to those clear policies that we have in place, back to daily usage to really, you get better through practice. That's not true with AI. I mean, it is true with AI. It's not exclusively true with AI. It's true with everything. The more you practice it, the better you're going to be at it, the better you're going to understand it.
They're definitely, and I definitely agree. Like the more time you use it, and there's that great saying, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yes,
With all things, AI definitely seems to be, like its capabilities and what you can do with it seems to be accelerating at a pace like no other tool that we've seen before.
Mhm.
So them sort of worries that you talked about being left behind, there definitely feels like there's going to be quite a fast, or like a rapidly growing gap of like people that are working with it day to day now, um versus people that maybe only start to work with it in maybe like a year's time. So there's like this huge like learning curve maybe, or
Right.
capability gap that may exist.
Yeah, the other really interesting thing that we saw in our data was that as practitioners, like the growth in the number of tasks and how much you're relying on AI is really ramping up, as you said. But we also see organizations prioritizing this. And when I take those two things together, like there's conversations happening in the boardroom and sort of mandates being pushed down. You shall use more AI, and we want to use AI to really optimize our business. At the same time, you have sort of that practitioner-led grassroots movement of, yes, we want to use more AI because we're getting better. And I think this, pressure from both the bottom and the top makes AI unique relative to some of the recent technology advances that we've had, and I liken this back to when Docker first came on the scene and containerization was all the rage and we're all moving applications into containers. Like that was a conversation that happened at the practitioner level daily and almost never in the boardroom. I can't think of maybe a handful of boards that were like, what's our container strategy going to be? But every board today is asking that same question about AI. And it is these two signals, like that there's that top down and the bottom up, that really show that this is transformational or has the potential to be transformational to so many organizations.
Mm.
And transformation can go both ways. It can be a very positive thing and it can be a very negative thing. So we want to make sure that we're driving the right motions for all of our teams and organizations.
Yeah, and just you talking about that coming from both directions and just touching like tying that back to what you were mentioning before around giving like teams this real focus. Yeah, I'm definitely excited about the potential that it has for organizations.
Yeah.
So so that's a nice dive into AI and engineering performance. Let's talk a bit about documentation, flow and DevX or developer experience. And you talked about documentation improving, kind of touched on like flow maybe being
Mhm.
impacted a bit in terms of like that sort of feedback loop. But you definitely talked about developer experience improving based on AI. But yeah, so like why does documentation, remain such a performance multiplier, but we often see it being overlooked?
Yeah, it is really interesting. We've looked into the impacts of quality documentation for the last 4 years or so within the DORA research program. And specifically, the documentation that we're looking at is internal documentation. So this isn't necessarily end user documentation. How do I use this service? This is documentation that's meant for the team that's responsible for building, deploying, operating, running that particular application. And we see that having better documentation in place, higher quality documentation, and this is another interesting thing, right? It's not quantity of documentation. Like we don't measure documentation by the pound, right? We measure it by quality. So how do you measure quality documentation? This is a challenge that we have as researchers, and one of the primary methods that we have for collecting data is through surveys. And so when we think about documentation, we want to use a survey to understand how do you assess documentation quality. And the way that we do that, we have questions or really we use a number of statements, and we use those statements together with a Likert scale, which essentially, as a respondent to our survey, you respond to these statements somewhere between strongly disagree and strongly agree, or I don't know. And so the statements that we used in 2024, I'll just read them off really quickly. I have them right in front of me. I can rely on our technical documentation when I need to use or work with the services or applications I work on. So can you rely on it? It is easy to find the right technical document when I need to understand something about the services or applications I work on. So it's reliable, you can find it. Technical documentation is updated as changes are made. And finally, when there's an incident or a problem that needs troubleshooting, I reach for the documentation. So we've kind of captured four different qualities or four different facets, if you will, of documentation quality. Is it reliable? Is it easy to find? Is it up to date? And is it helpful? Are you reaching for it when there's something that needs troubleshooting? And when you start thinking about it and framing documentation that way, it's no surprise that documentation is sort of it unlocks so many different things across an organization, across a team. It unlocks things like what processes are we using? We see it impacting your ability as a team to practice good continuous integration, to have good automated testing. Well, how does it do that? Well, it helps encapsulate some of that tribal knowledge, if you will, about this is how we work. These are the types of things that we do for this application, and it really unlocks those. The other interesting thing that we see, though, coming back to AI, we see that as you increase your AI adoption, your technical documentation really sees a big impact on that. But there's a curious way of looking at that. I don't know what you've done today, Shane, but I would imagine that already this week, it's only Tuesday, but at some point this week, you've probably used AI to summarize some sort of content, right? And
Yeah.
and we see that happening a lot. In our survey, we see a high number of respondents that are using AI to summarize information. Well, so you might be using AI to summarize the existing documentation that you have, and that doesn't necessarily change the underlying value of that documentation or the underlying quality of that documentation, but it allows you as an individual to get more utility out of that documentation. So we have this question, is it actually improving documentation quality? Because maybe now you're using AI to write better documentation, or is it simply giving you more utility from the underlying documentation? I think the answer is probably yes. It's both helping you write more documentation. It helps you get over sort of that blank page anxiety, right? We can start writing with AI, but it's also giving us better value out of the existing documentation that we have.
Mm. And it's making it more consumable as well for
Yes,
other
exactly.
users. And
Mhm.
like if I think about in the technical space and maybe you're not technical but you want it summarized from like a business perspective, I can see like a lot of really good use cases in that space. And when we think about these different AI agents that's even search or whatever you might be using AI in your organization to do,
Mhm.
that documentation that's you're feeding it really needs to be of a decent quality for your AI to be of decent quality as well. So there's kind of like
Yes.
a circular piece here where you need the good quality data for the AI as well. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It is interesting how, maybe one day in the future we'll be writing most of our documentation for the bots, not
Mm,
necessarily for other humans. And what are the implications of that? I think is a
yeah.
fascinating question to think about.
Yeah, I actually had I was playing around with some of the AI coding applications, and we are going through like a few fixes, and it was referencing documentation that was out of date, and
Oh yeah.
it was doing all the checks, and it was saying, yeah, we just need to change this and this, but it was outdated documentation. So
Mhm.
yeah. So it's an exciting space with lots of interesting challenges. So
Indeed.
yeah, it's kind of hard to get away from the AI conversation, even though we're talking about
Of
documentation.
course, of course.
Uh, so see, in terms of like developer experience, like what are some of like the really simple ways that teams can improve this today?
Yeah, I think um the simplest way to improve developer experience, I think, is to have a conversation about developer experience. And really trying to identify like where does it hurt?
Mm,
And what can we do to alleviate some of that pain? You know, um, there's always this question of are happy developers productive or are productive developers happy, right? Like which comes first? Are you happy because you're productive, or are you productive because you're happy? And setting all of like the chicken or the egg problem
mm,
aside, if you will, I think we all have had, unfortunately, those experiences where there's a high amount of friction and this doesn't matter if you're a developer or any other role, whatever role you're in, when there's a high amount of friction, you don't feel productive. You can't feel happy when you're not productive. It's very difficult to do, and that friction just it eats away at you. And so I think the thing to do to really help improve that developer experience is go and identify, like name and shame that friction, if you will. Like go point at that friction and let's say, you know what, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We're going to take some of our capacity to reduce some of that friction and recognizing that that's an investment in our long-term health and sustainability and performance and so forth. And then, frankly, taking some of those gains that you get from reducing some friction and reinvesting those gains to go after the next piece of friction. And this is why I love practices like value stream mapping, where we get together with a cross-functional team to really map out, like, how does software get into production? In simply drawing up that map, you start to identify lots and lots of pain points, lots and lots of friction, some of which is very easy to just either eliminate or automate away, just to improve that. And every time you take a step forward, that's going to have, it's kind of like compound interest, right? It's just going to pay off more and more over time.
I've seen I really like that concept of like naming and shaming the friction points or the pain points. And I've seen an organization do this really well. They weren't talking really about developer experience. It was like the
Mhm.
whole organization experience. And they had
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard of the Cool Wall from a it was from a car TV program over here in the UK. But
Okay.
they had like all these different cars, they'd put it up on the wall and they'd say, well, it was like super cool or not cool, and they had like Sub-Zero for like really cool things. So they had
Okay.
this wall visually as you walked into the organization, and leaders could see it, and any employee could go up and put up like those pain points, whether it was like something that was super cool or not, and leadership could then take action and like move them forward and look at how to improve them. So
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah. I
yeah.
love the visualization, right? And being
Mhm.
able to see where those pain points are,
Yeah.
can really have an impact on an organization.
Yeah, because they go unknown, or like they're
Mhm.
hidden so often, and you don't really, even as a leader you might not be aware of this.
Yep.
Um so a wee bit more documentation before we move on.
Sure.
Uh in terms of like high performing teams, how do
Mhm.
they handle documentation differently to other teams?
Yeah, this is really important. And I think first and foremost, high performing teams recognize that documentation is technical work. Technical writing is technical work, right?
Mm.
It is engineering. It is part of the role. And they manifest that by talking about it during performance reviews. It comes up. Are you doing documentation? Are you contributing to the documentation? We create space for engineers to help craft that documentation, and go and fix it when it's wrong. High performing teams also have mechanisms in place to keep documentation up to date. There's a great system within Google, where anytime you write a piece of documentation that's, internal documentation, there's a bunch of metadata or head matter in the documents. We store all of our documents in our version control system. That's maybe another tip, right? Store the documentation right along with the code. But in this sort of metadata about each document uh, there are two things. There's a date that documentation was last updated, and then there's almost like an expiration date, if you will, like a freshness date. How fresh, or how long do we expect this documentation to stay fresh? And let's say it's 6 months or 12 months or whatever it is. But then we have systems that will go through and sort of comb the documentation and find documentation that is now out of date, and bugs will be opened up, right? Issues tracked, put into the
Mm.
backlog of that team to say, hey, this documentation is out of date. And it gets assigned to the owners of that documentation. So that really builds in the practice of of helping you keep the documentation up to date, right? Identifying documentation that's out of date is toilsome work. It's hard. That's friction. Let's
Mm.
eliminate that friction. And we're going to build this right into your daily workflows. You may have bugs showing up on your backlog that are just simply out of date documentation. And of course, that documentation might still be fresh, right? It might still be correct, but at least now we've put another set of eyes on it 12 months later to validate, yes, this is still the ground truth. This is still accurate documentation.
And do you have like any mechanisms in there for like say a developer or teams using a piece of documentation that they can feed back like in terms of like complete versus accurate, and that maybe triggers something as well?
Yeah, we definitely have that as well. And, with the documentation being part of the code base, frankly, as an engineer, if I come across inaccurate documentation, I should do the same as if I came across inaccurate code.
Mm.
I'm not just going to like say, oh boy, well that function's really crappy. well, on with my day. No, I'm going to stop and fix it, right? I'm going to do the cleanup while I'm right there in the code base. You should do the same with the documentation. And again, that goes back to how is that rewarded when it comes time to performance reviews and things along those lines. We want to reward that work.
Yeah, so there's definitely a leadership responsibility in that space.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, so let's talk a bit more about leading high performance teams. So what does transformational leadership look like in a DevOps context?
Yeah, transformational leadership is, again, it's one of those things that we've looked at over the years within the DORA research program. And I think transformational leadership, maybe one of the best ways to understand what transformational leadership looks like is to contrast it to something. And that would be something like transactional leadership. Hey, Shane, this is the thing that you need to do, and maybe
Mm,
even how to do it. That's not transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is about helping set a vision and using inspiring conversation to get people excited about that vision, but then stepping back and letting the team, the practitioners, go and attack, like have the autonomy to go solve that problem. I think that's the biggest thing with transformational leadership is that you have that vision, and then you give the teams the autonomy to execute. And that autonomy to execute includes making choices that the team needs to make in order to help the organization meet that vision. I think that's really, really important. And unfortunately, as leaders, you know, when things get rough, there's a human tendency to like tighten our grip, right? Things are starting to go bad. That means I need to exert more control over everything. And probably when things are going bad as a transformational leader, that's probably more a signal to go and listen and try to observe what's happening so that you can guide but not control. How do we get out of this, particular bad spot that we're in? How do we move forward?
I really like that sort of contrast of transactional versus
Mhm.
transformational. And so setting that vision and really empowering the teams to be autonomous in how they achieve that really requires there to be an element of trust and psychological safety because you're taking risks, right? So you're
Yes.
making decisions as a team. So how do you build that trust and psychological safety while maintaining high delivery expectations that all organizations have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is certainly something, again, that we've researched over the years. We find consistently that the culture of the organization is one of the biggest drivers or determinants of whether or not you're going to be a high-performing team. And that culture, we measure it a number of different ways. Of course, we lean on other researchers outside of or within Google. There was Project Aristotle, which really identified that psychological safety as the number one attribute of a high-performing team. We also within DORA have utilized the research from a sociologist named Dr. Ron Westrom, who has Westrom's topology of organizational cultures. And within that topology, Westrom kind of outlines sort of three sort of prototypes of or archetypes of an organization. You have your pathological organization, which is very power oriented. You have your bureaucratic organization, which is very rule oriented. And then the generative organization, which is really performance oriented. And oftentimes I look at when I go and look at an organization, I want to understand like how does your team respond when something goes really bad? And this is it's always sort of indicative of what is the overall culture of the organization. When things get really hard, what happens? And then also every organization has had an incident recently, right? Every organization that deals with technology has had some
Mhm.
incident recently. So there's always it's fertile ground to go and sort of understand how does an organization respond to those sorts of incidents? Are they looking for someone to fire? Or are they looking to learn from that incident? And that's really what we see is that leaders show up in a way that allows for learning within the organization and that encourages learning within the organization. You can, excuse me, you can see this through incentives that get set. You can see this through how a leader shows up after an incident, All of these things are really important. And it does come back to that psychological safety. We want to encourage risk taking. We want to encourage innovation. In fact, they're the same thing, right? An
Mm.
innovation is a risk, and understanding that is really important. There's also, I'll borrow some words from John Allspaw, who's does a lot of work in sort of the resilience engineering space. And one of the things that he always reminds us is that, we oftentimes, when something goes bad, we oftentimes ask, like, what was the root cause of that? What was the single thing that caused that thing to go off the rails? But when we have a success, we never ask, what was the root cause of that success? Because
Mm.
we know that there was no root cause of that success. It was a conglomeration, a convergence of many different things that had to come together in order to drive that success. Well, success and failure are basically opposite sides of the same coin. So the same is true with failure as with success. It's never one cause. It's a conglomeration or a convergence of factors that come together, usually in an unexpected way, that led us to this outcome. So really learning from that incident and learning, it becomes so, so important.
I really, I really, really digging into those root causes of failure and how you responded are definitely
Mhm.
telling. And it's not really been that long ago since we went through the whole COVID pandemic, and you really seen
Yeah,
how different organizations and how leadership responded in that space. Yeah. Uh, we'll do a bit of a quick fire round before we finish, but before we get into
sure.
that, I've got one more question for you, and then I've got a question from Neil Martin as well. Just
Oh,
he's in
great.
the chat, so we'll cover those two first, and then I'll give you a couple of quick fire rounds. There'll be people listening today and watching us back, and they'll be hearing what you're saying and maybe thinking that they might have a bit of a long way to go, or their team are already high performing. What's one thing that every person and our team or leader can start doing tomorrow, really?
Yeah, I think it's the same piece of advice, whether you feel like, wow, we've got such a mountain to climb
Mm,
because we're not yet high performing, or the team that does view themselves as high performing, it's the same piece of advice or same behavior that I see that really drives this. What are you going to do next? What's the next step you're going to take? Because the truth is, if you've reached the top of the mountain, right? If you are that high performing team and you sit back and you rest on your laurels, another team comes by and delivers at a higher quality, a higher performance, etc.
mm,
And over time you start to slip as well. Uh, and and look, one of the things that I always remind a team is that elite performance is not your goal. Your goal is elite improvement. And
mm,
elite improvement means continuous improvement. Uh, and this means that we're always chasing the horizon. We will never get to the horizon. It's not a thing that we do and now we're done and we can stop because we've arrived. There's always more. There's always more to do, which is which can be both inspiring and really deflating. And so again, this comes back to kind of, how does your leader show up? How does your leader show up to drive that, and allow for that? And it is continuous improvement over the long term, right? And
mm,
so this does mean making investments for our long-term sustainability, our long-term growth, not necessarily this quarter's growth or this week's growth, but let's look at this over the long term. And when we take small steps and we, sort of lean into compound interest, that's where we really start to see the most benefit. And so I think it's important that we're always questioning and learning and hypothesizing and experimenting and trying new things and never, trying to avoid falling in the rut of this is how we do things around here. There's always
mm.
something that you can do differently. And maybe different is better, maybe different is worse, but we won't know until we try.
Definitely, and those boundaries will definitely continually, or that horizon will definitely continue to get further and further away. Now that's
Yes.
AIs in this space for sure, and not just from a technology perspective, but the whole policy space and how you operate there, and like your role changing from really being somebody that writes code to maybe stepping into that more sort of architecture or solution space or design space.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, cool. So always keep improving. What is that next step? Uh, cool. Right. So before our quick fire rounds, we have Neil Martin, he's joining from near Edinburgh and is interested in hearing more about the barriers to intelligent exec sponsorship.
Ooh. Well, uh, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so apologies, but
Okay.
I'm gonna throw out one thing that I see happening all the time that maybe harms intelligent executive sponsorship. As technologists, we lean into things like software delivery performance, and DORA gives us 4 clear metrics of how to talk about software delivery performance. And then as technologists, we turn around and we go to our leaders, specifically our business leaders, and we talk about our deployment frequency. And no business leader cares about your deployment frequency. They simply don't, because that's not what we're doing. We don't measure customer success by how many times did we change the software that our customers use. We measure customer success and business outcomes through other things. And so I think as technologists, the best way that we can lean in to get better executive sponsorship is to build those bridges and to really understand what is the business trying to achieve? What is our sponsor trying to achieve? And how do we align the way that we talk about that? And how do we help them both understand the power of more frequent deployments or shorter change lead times? But we use that and talk about it in terms of the business impact that it's going to create. Part of the reason that DORA has its center of gravity around software delivery performance is because we've shown over the years that as you improve that, you get better organizational outcomes, you get better well-being for the team. But I always say, like, don't trust our research, replicate it. So put your software delivery performance metrics next to the business KPIs that you care about. They should be moving together. That's what we expect to see. So go prove that. Go prove that within your context, within your organization. That's the thing that matters most. And so I think to build that better bridge with your executive sponsor, it starts with a conversation, right? At the end of the day, we're all still humans. We may be leveraging AI to talk to one another, but there's still that human component that we need. We need to go and seek to understand what are their goals, what are they trying to accomplish, and help them frame both how our work gets us there, but also help ourselves and our teams understand how our work helps achieve those business outcomes.
Perfect. So Neil, hopefully that answers the question.
Hopefully that helps, Neil. Yeah.
Thanks, Nathan. So I'll give you a couple of quick fire rounds just before we wrap up.
All
So
right.
we've talked a lot about DORA metrics today. Is there one DORA metric you should never ignore?
Uh, Although it's not officially a DORA metric, I would say the number of conversations that you have about what you're going to do next. That is
Okay.
the one that is most important to me.
Maybe a new metric we'll see in the
There
next
we
round,
go.
potentially. Um, what's your AI superpower or the tool that you use the most?
Yeah, well, I work at Google, so I use a lot of Gemini
Mm.
based tools, including Gemini Code Assist. Though we recently released Gemini Code Assist for GitHub, which is a really cool, takes 2 minutes to install this application. But the thing it does is it provides you high quality code reviews. So the minute a PR is opened, it will both summarize the changes of that PR as a comment to the PR, and it will do a code review, including suggesting changes. Now, this is extremely powerful because one of the biggest bottlenecks that we see consistently is the amount of time it takes to do a code review within a team. Now, injecting AI in there is not going to solve the problem, but it
Mm.
is going to start. Like, it gives me, as the developer of that change, some immediate feedback that I can go and address. Sometimes that feedback will be wrong, in the same way that a code review that you have with your peers will sometimes be wrong or something that you disagree with. And that's fine. But now I'm getting that feedback almost instantaneously. And I think that's really powerful, and I've really enjoyed that. There are also opportunities that you have to inject custom rules and configurations, which again, we're using on some of the projects that I'm working on, and I find that really, really helpful.
Cool. So thanks for taking those quick fire round questions at the end. Folks, everyone that's joined, thanks for attending. This really means a lot to us at Accelerate. And Nathen, it's been an absolute pleasure as well. So thanks for spending time with us to share your story, your passions, your inspirations, everything around DORA, Google, and AI. And for everybody watching, please follow Atlassian and Accelerate on LinkedIn. Yeah, check out our events page. We have some really nice guests coming up in the future. We've got Teresa Torres coming up next. So looking forward to seeing you all on that session. And yeah, that's a wrap.